Picture a nice, scenic park. You're walking down the footpath or sidewalk, and you notice how picturesque the landscape looks. You get the urge to capture the moment, and so you reach for your phone and take it out. You snap a photograph, but you're left disappointed with what you see on screen. Maybe the photo is too dark or too bright, and things just don't look properly lit. You've since probably had the desire to get better pictures, but you don't really know how. Well, it's actually not that complicated. If you get a photo with inaccurate lighting, it might be because of poor dynamic range. If we take our vision, for example, the human eye, it can see in a wide dynamic range, meaning we can see both the brights and the darks of a scene. So when we try to photograph a scene with both a bright point of light and a dim subject, foreground or background, the range on our cameras often simply isn't wide enough to capture those differences and preserve detail at the same time. However, while your cameras may not match the human eye, they can actually take more dynamic photos via what's called HDR mode turned on. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. When you enable this on your phone, it can take photos more accurate to what we see. Let's see what HDR can do in the same scene compared to the standard camera setting. The first photo you see here is a standard one, and the next one is an HDR one. Here are some more examples of different photos I've taken of the same scenes using both the standard and HDR modes on my smartphone. So, as you can see, HDR photos are definitely an improvement over the standard photos in many situations when there are highly contrasting brightness or exposure levels required. However, this is just the first step you can take to having better photos. The next step would be to go manual. The default camera apps on many phones give a basic level of access to camera settings, but there are several third-party apps that give users full control over all settings. My favorite manual camera app for the iPhone is ProCam, but really almost all have the same functionality. Manual camera apps give control over ISO, shutter speed, and focus. ISO levels dictate how sensitive the camera is to light, making images darker or brighter. The higher the setting, the more noisy the image will be. Shutter speed is how quickly the camera captures a photo. You can use a slower shutter speed to capture motion blur, like in this image, or a faster shutter speed to freeze motion and action without any blur, like in this image. Each setting influences the other, so it's all about balancing the different aspects of your camera. For example, lower ISO means you'll need a slower shutter speed to compensate for the otherwise darker images. Higher shutter speed means you'll need higher ISOs to keep the brightness up as well. So by playing around with these settings, you can take wacky images like this one, or ones like this using a tripod where you can use moving light sources to essentially paint lines in the image. But even manual apps on your phone have their limits in what they can do. For example, the sensor size of most smartphone cameras is very small and has no adjustable aperture. This means it's much harder to get a shallow depth of field, which is needed for the popular blurry background effect. Fixed apertures can also mean more noisy images, especially if the built-in aperture is more narrow and cannot let in more light if needed. This is where a fully dedicated camera, like a digital SLR, can help you get better photos. Cameras like this DSLR, the Nikon D3100, give you full control over all camera settings, including the exposure trio of the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. With the ability to widen and narrow the aperture, you can play around with depth of field and even get the bokeh effect, where objects in the distance become blurred circles. Here are a few shots I've taken using a wide aperture with my DSLR. When widening the aperture, you get extra light on, so you might have to increase the shutter speed and/or lower the ISO to compensate. For landscapes, you can use the same lens with a more narrow aperture. This creates a much greater depth of field, meaning nearly everything near and far will be in focus. So next time you plan on going to a nice place, take your camera with you, or even your phone with the manual camera app. Play around with different settings and have fun while taking better photos. Thanks for watching and happy photographing!